Welcome to the world premiere of Cadillac Ranch, an original symphony created by Grammy-winning composer Michael Daugherty and performed by the Amarillo Symphony. In celebration of its 100th year, the symphony commissioned Daugherty to write an original composition inspired by the Cadillac Ranch roadside attraction on Interstate 40, just west of the Amarillo, Texas city limits. You've just heard the introduction to the piece as it was performed in October 2024 by the Amarillo Symphony and recorded at the Globe News Center for the Performing Arts in Amarillo, Texas.
I love commissioning, and we've commissioned a lot of works, and I think with composers I really love telling a composer, here are the kind of boundaries of what we're looking for. Be creative as you are as a composer within those boundaries. And actually the conversation with Michael Daugherty started with him. He was here, I think, at one of our concerts by chance.
In 2022, I was doing a residency with the band there at West Texas A&M University in Canyon, Texas. I went to a concert of the Amarillo Symphony when I was there and had a great conversation with George Jackson, who is the conductor of the orchestra, afterwards. And he said, would you be interested in composing a piece for the orchestra? And the first thing that came to my mind, yes, Cadillac Ranch. That's just been one of the bucket list things that I've always wanted to do. And I've been to Cadillac Ranch about 3 times. I have not spray painted the cars though, however.
We got chatting, and at that point we hadn't commissioned him. But he had observed that many of his album covers had the Cadillac Ranch as an Americana kind of icon for his work, none of which had anything to do with Cadillac Ranch. And he kind of said, well, I've never written anything on that theme, although that image is very associated with his kind of status as a composer. And so immediately I thought, well, this is perfect. It's time to ask him. And of all the living composers, particularly American living composers, he's perfect because a lot of his music kind of represents that same kind of icon.
In June of 1974, 3 experimental architects and artists from a collective known as Ant Farm buried 10 Cadillacs nose first in the ground on agricultural land outside Amarillo, and a landmark was born.
People would get out of their cars and walk out there. And as you approach it, I think it's really interesting that it takes on a more sculptural form. You realize it's not, you can see that they're actual cars, but the arrangement has made them into something else, has made them into that artwork.
The roadside attraction along I-40 draws an estimated 1.4 million visitors a year, and it is a favorite stop of American and foreign tourists traveling the Mother Road, Route 66.
I thought it was amazing. Funnily enough, I compared it to Stonehenge in England because I drive past Stonehenge quite a lot. And it's the same kind of thing, that it's very kind of mystical and it's there, but also it's part of everyday life. And yes, people come to visit it, but also the fact that you don't have to visit it, you just drive past it, is also part of the experience.
I think that people are attracted to Cadillac Ranch because, first of all, they recognize the Cadillac and the history of that. At the same time, they can participate in the art sculpture because they can spray paint whatever they want on the cars. I think that people like me, I'm interested in it because the concept behind it, you have 10 cars dating from 1949 to 1964, symmetrically spaced, all the same height. So it's like a modernist sculpture, and at the same time it resonates in pop culture as well.
One of the things we shared was this obsession with cars, but we were both trained as architects, so we imagined sort of putting that aside, I guess. But as we started working together, we didn't have any clients or anything, so we had to more or less invent projects. And I don't know, that eventually became Ant Farm. The idea in the 50s was you were supposed to work your way up the model it would be, in the case of Ford, it would be a Lincoln, but in the case of a Chevrolet, it would be a Cadillac. And so we were very aware of that, the way styling was being used as an instrument of sales. But it was also exciting to see, every year the cars changed pretty radically in some cases in the mid-1950s. So we began amongst ourselves sketching out things having to do with tail fins.
Doherty transformed tail fins to tempo. In Cadillac Ranch, the symphony, pitches often are presented in rows of 10, and rhythmic pulses appear in patterns of 10.
He took each of the 10 Cadillacs, the years that they were made, and figured out what the music was of that day, that year. And it was popular music. Not just classical music, but popular music of that day.
So the first one is 1949. We hear sort of It's a Summer Place. There was a film from that time period with the piano going da 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 da.
By now, you'll have identified a recurring theme in the composition, commonly known as a musical motive or motif.
At the beginning, we have the motive, da 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 da. Which is Cadillac Ranch, Cadillac Ranch. And you're going to hear that motive throughout the entire work.
A motive is a short, distinctive musical idea that serves as a building block for a composition.
When people ask about a musical motive, why is that important? Well, it's important for some composers, not all composers. But for me, it's kind of the main thing to hang your hat on.
So it's basically like a calling card. And the idea is that, and it depends where you go in music history, but, for example, let's say Mozart, the G minor symphony, where he writes, that then continues throughout the symphony. It develops into a melody. It develops through that first movement. And what he does is he uses a tiny kind of almost like an ingredient. That becomes this thing that he plays around with, different keys, different instruments. And so in a way, a composer's creativity, I think, is very much related to what they can imagine doing with a particular set of notes. Probably the most similar example is Beethoven 5, which has the same number of notes. It's really just taking an ingredient and how far can you get? What can you do with this ingredient? You find it all over the place.
Using musical motives is something that composers have done throughout history, especially in the 18th and 19th century. In the 20th century, it sort of broke down a little bit in classical music, where using motives or recognizable ideas was done less and less. However, in popular music, that's not the case, especially in television music, which I grew up with, which all had great theme songs. So if you take Henry Mancini, like Peter Gunn, for example, do do da do 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 da do 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 da da da, or the Riflemen, do 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 da bum ba bum bum ba dun 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 da, or I Dream of Jeannie, da 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 dee da dee da 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 da, and so forth. So having these catchy motives is something that I grew up with. Every television show at the time had that, and so that's something I've kind of carried on in my pieces. The second movement, 1952, is kind of a slow, mysterious movement. And I'm thinking about when you're at Cadillac Ranch during the night and the sun's going down.
About 70 musicians took the stage to perform Cadillac Ranch.
It was a good number of people because there was a lot of percussion, and that's extra players. And the string section's about the same size as a normal orchestra piece, but it had extra winds, like the saxophone, and there was a bass clarinet and things like that that are a little unusual for an orchestra. But that's typical of Michael Dougherty's work. He likes to incorporate unusual sounds or sounds that come from different genres.
The third movement, 1954, is very fast. And you hear the da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, and it has elements of jazz in it.
also has a rock and jazz background. He loves that kind of music, and he always incorporates it into what he's doing, no matter what the piece is.
I grew up in a family with 5 boys. Both my parents were musicians. I just grew up in a house with music was happening all the time. When I was a teenager, we had a rock band called the Soul Company, and the neighbors called the police all the time because we were making too much noise. We had a player piano, the old piano that you put the piano rolls in, and I pretty much taught myself how to play piano by watching the piano rolls and watching the keys move on the piano. Growing up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the late 50s and 60s, there were no books really on how to learn jazz. So I learned how to play jazz and rock music by having recordings, listening to them, and trying to figure out what was going on. When I took piano lessons, I would improvise all the time if I was trying to play, a classical piece of music. So my teacher made a deal. Okay, 50% of our piano lesson we'll do classical, 50% we'll do jazz.
While studying jazz at North Texas State University, Doherty attended a Dallas Symphony concert.
I heard the Barber Piano Concerto, remember, and the Rite of Spring of Stravinsky, and I was in the front row having a student ticket, hearing the orchestra, and I was amazed by the sound, and I really wanted to learn how to write for orchestra. I went back to North Texas State, spent time in the library, checked out scores, and really taught myself how to compose. And ever since, I'm a huge fan of orchestra music, band music. You see behind me a huge collection of scores. So it's something that I live in and breathe.
Well, I played the violin as a kid, and I loved playing in youth orchestra, especially. I was always in a rock band when I was a kid as a guitarist. I was a drummer for a while, and I kind of enjoyed, with my free time as a teenager, being a musician and playing music with other people. And I did actually play the piano as a kid, and I would never practice. So I think maybe I was about 6 or 7, and basically my parents just said, if you're not going to practice, we're not going to pay for the lessons. So it's like, okay. And I regret it, because I definitely think I could have developed more in piano from earlier on. But also I think the violin is a great instrument for a conductor. Just because of the contact that you have with the string section in an orchestra, for example. And as lovely as the piano is, it's quite a lonely instrument. There are only certain situations where you're with other musicians. And so I think coming from a violin tradition, I think it's much more useful for playing music as a group. And then I remember one rehearsal as a youth symphony violinist, actually playing Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, and the conductor explaining the kind of story behind the piece.
That's the first phrase. Can you hear the lovesick yearning in that melody? The way it has a rising shape at the beginning?
And for me, it was very interesting because my parents are actors. So I come from a kind of a theatrical background a little bit, but I was interested in music and suddenly discovered that actually symphonic music, which I'd always thought of as quite boring and abstract, has this narrative, has this amazing story. And so I think from then on, as a teenager, I suddenly thought this is an incredible art form that I didn't know very much about, but enjoyed getting to know and really was passionate about it.
Then we go to the next movement, 1956, which is a bossa nova.
As described in the book Brazil, 5 Centuries of Change, bossa nova means new wave and is a mix of samba and jazz that originated in 1956 in Rio de Janeiro's Copacabana neighborhood.
But each day when she walks to the sea, she looks straight ahead, not at heel.
That's a great movement. People really connect to that. It makes them want to get up and dance almost.
Then we go to the fifth movement, 1957, which is Mexican music.
One of the first pieces I conducted, in fact, the first piece I conducted here in my first season was Route 66, and a very, very similar idea of a journey through Route 66. There's this wonderful idea that actually he's used a classical form in the context of this sculpture, which is incredible. I think one of the things I first thought of, and he hadn't realized this, but it's a bit like Mussorgsky pictures at an exhibition, because it's almost like we're visiting each Cadillac.
Russian composer Modest Mussorgsky wrote Pictures at an Exhibition in 1874 as a piano suite in 10 movements, the same number as Doherty's Cadillac Ranch composition. The composer wrote it after viewing an exhibition of paintings by his late friend Victor Hartmann at the Imperial Academy of Arts in St. Petersburg. Each movement represents one of Hartmann's paintings. Some of the works are lost to history, but images of a few paintings survive.
He had this idea of going through an art gallery and being inspired by the paintings. So it's a very similar idea. It's almost like an American Pictures at an Exhibition, the way that I think it's put together.
The most performed version of the work is a 1922 orchestration by composer Maurice Ravel. Mussorgsky introduces and connects the movements with a motive he refers to as a promenade, a stroll from painting to painting. Here's a bit of the opening promenade. In the 1970s, progressive rock supergroup Emerson, Lake and Palmer adapted and released its own version of Pictures at an Exhibition.
Lead me from tortured dreams, childhood themes of nights alone.
Well, one of the things that makes 20th century and now 21st century music for orchestra or band or whatever, it makes it sound new is through the percussion. So you have so many different instruments to pick from in the percussion. You know, not only the pitched instruments, the timpani, the chimes, the glockenspiel, the marimba, the vibraphone, and so forth. But then you also have all the instruments from different cultures. You know, tambourine and bongos and djembes and you know, wind chimes and all sorts of, you know, things that you can do to augment the sound. So I think the percussion is something that I really enjoy. My father was a drummer, actually. So I've always had an affinity for percussion, and it's something that makes the piece sound like it wasn't written back in 1810 or something, where there wasn't much percussion.
I mean, 3 percussion players plus timpani and just so many different instruments, lots of logistics. There's some amazing vibraphone moments, lots of xylophone. So lots of tuned instruments, but then also lots of kind of loud, non-tuned percussion. I think, again, it really makes the piece because you get the excitement. Car horns was one of the really cool things.
George Gershwin famously used car horns to evoke the bustle of city life in his jazz-influenced symphonic poem, An American in Paris. Spending time in Paris in March 1928, the composer and a friend visited automobile shops there and purchased taxi horns to work into the score. The Gershwin composition served as the basis for the 1951 MGM musical, An American in Paris. During Amarillo Symphony rehearsals, Doherty adjusted the Cadillac Ranch score.
In the 6th movement, 1958, I wanted to originally use a car horn to punctuate, so it goes like... And then there'd be a car horn, like that. But the problem was you really couldn't hear it. So I decided instead to use a police whistle, which really cuts through the orchestra. So
listen for the police whistle as you experience Cadillac Ranch Movement 6, 1958.
the 7th movement, 1959, is kind of a cool jazz movement, I guess, from the 50s.
For inspiration, Doherty recalled jazz saxophonist Paul Desmond and the Dave Brubeck Quartet with Desmond on sax.
A lot of Michael Doherty's music, it's not classical in that sense. It's influenced by all sorts of styles. You know, the saxophone isn't a common instrument. Interestingly, it's in Pictures at an Exhibition, which is where I think there's a connection. But actually, we don't get to hear saxophone very often, and so it's beautiful to hear that in that context. And he actually writes that they should stand up as well, and so there's that jazz influence there. But that's a really beautiful sound.
In Cadillac Ranch, I'm not really quoting any particular themes, but probably, you know, growing up as I did with television and movies and so forth, I'm sure that those things, certain things will filter through in some kind of way, and perhaps in a subconscious way.
Let's revisit those tumbling notes of the saxophone. Now, listen to Gee's Bend, a piece Doherty wrote for electric guitar and orchestra.
Yeah, you're right. There is a portion of Gee's Bend. I take a couple licks from Gee's Bend and put that in Cadillac Ranch. Yeah, I wrote a electric guitar concerto, which was played in Amarillo a while back, and entitled Gee's Bend. And I actually went to Gee's Bend. It's a small hamlet in Alabama, where African American women for decades have made these amazing quilts. So actually. Flew to Birmingham, rented a car, drove about 3 hours into the backwoods, so to speak, to this little town of Gee's Bend. And I stayed there for a day. I talked to the women. I went to where they make the quilts and so forth. And, you know, that gave me the permission, so to speak, or the inspiration to then come back and write this guitar concerto inspired by my visit to Gee's Bend. So the process for me to make it authentic, so to speak, that I feel like I have permission to write something about a subject, I like to have contact with that subject in some way. So for example, I wrote a piece for the Detroit Symphony called Rosa Parks Boulevard, and actually I was able to meet Rosa Parks in Detroit, for example, and attend a church service with her. And after meeting her, I asked her, "What's your favorite instrument?" She said, "The trombone." So then I wrote a piece for 3 trombones and orchestra. When I wrote Route 66, I drove Route 66. When I wrote a piece called Mount Rushmore, I went to Mount Rushmore and hung out. when I did Cadillac Ranch, I went to Cadillac Ranch. And so being there, walking around, you just kind of get ideas, but it's sort of mysterious how those ideas are translated into music or into drama or into film or whatever. That's kind of the mysterious part. I really can't tell you for sure. Well, one of the challenges of writing for a large ensemble, be it an orchestra or a wind ensemble or whatever, is that you have a lot of players. Now, if they're all playing all at the same time, you don't really hear anything. So what I like to do is to have particular moments where certain instruments come forward, like there'll be a trombone solo or a flute solo. By having these different colors come forward, it gives the piece some a variety.
I think there are two types of preparation of a score. There's preparation in real time, where you're imagining, for example, a tempo, where you're actually thinking, okay, this is happening in this time. It's a little bit like if you're practicing the violin, you might play something in the time that you're going to play it in. But then there's also the kind of non-real time isolating aspects of studying. And that's the kind of studying that you do on like a plane or in a busy, in a station or on a train or something like that. And that's where you really take it apart a little bit and look at the relationships between instruments. So often you're also thinking, okay, well, I know our concert hall, I know our musicians, maybe that dynamic is a little too loud. Maybe we won't hear the relationship between those instruments. What we do as conductors is we kind of recreate what the composer's done in our own kind of way.
The Eighth Movement, 1960, is kind of Latin, kind of laid back, cool Latin music. That's one of my favorites, actually.
There's definitely an investment in the arts here. And I think that probably explains why there's a great concert hall, why there's a symphony that's over 100 years old. So I think that was my first impression. But I also think as well that because of the geographical location, I think that very often people in Amarillo almost need people to come from outside and remind them this is an incredible place, and what you have here is very rare, because people don't see it when you're in it all the time. They kind of think that it's just a standard thing that every town of 200,000 or so has, and so when I talk to patrons who've come from big cities in Texas where they have big symphonies, and they come here and they get the same thing that they did have in Houston or Dallas, and they find it here. You wouldn't get that in many smaller cities or smaller towns. And so I think that became apparent very quickly. How had I, living in West London, heard about an orchestra here in the Panhandle? But there was a global reputation already there. I think for many different reasons. Certainly the concert hall, which we're in, is very famous and is known throughout the world. But also, I think that the level of soloists that the orchestra attracts, and as I discovered later on, this interest in new music and interest in looking at different ideas for a symphonic concert. And very often you don't find that in many orchestras. A lot of orchestras, they want to play kind of, the standard repertoire, and stay very safe, which is absolutely fine. But I got the feeling here that people are interested in something unusual and really appreciate something different and something that they'll enjoy.
We want to stay current, and there's a lot of great living composers and that are doing wonderful work all over the world. George knows a lot of them personally that are from Europe. I know many here in the United States. We do this original work, and then it has our name on it. Right at the very top of the score, it says, commissioned by the Amarillo Symphony. And so wherever it's played, anywhere in the world, that's the musicians, the conductors, and the audience sees that. And so our name goes around the globe with all the new pieces that we commission. There's a lot of music out there that started right here in Amarillo, Texas.
Part of my job now is to try and bring it to other orchestras and try and create opportunities to perform the piece in other places, because it's very special to perform in the nearest orchestra to Cadillac Ranch, but how cool would it be to perform it in Paris or in Rome and actually focus on Cadillac Ranch, from far away.
The ninth movement, we're getting close here. 1962 is beautiful chords, and I was thinking of kind of like those amazing recordings of 1,000 Strings or something from the 60s. So maybe easy listening music. It doesn't sound like easy listening music, but the kind of timbre, the sonic roll is that.
Our job really as musicians is to get to the core of what the piece of music is. The biggest challenge is the tradition of performance that you face. So, for example, if we're performing a symphony that's 200 years old or something, the resources that are available to you through other recordings, other things written in the parts, the music that we play from, in various scores, and also now YouTube, for example, you can look at performances. In a way, it's challenging with more familiar, say, symphonies or something maybe more classical, because you've also got this kind of weight of tradition, and you have to make decisions on that. With this, nobody else has performed this, which is, again, as a conductor, you're very privileged because, first of all, nobody else has the score. The kinds of things that you encounter, you really think about in a different way because you don't have the experience of someone else playing the piece or having already played the piece. And so you feel there's a bit more responsibility, and you also feel you've brought it, into fruition. the actual rehearsal process is really part of it, because you also develop your interpretations. Michael Dougherty is fantastic because he's very active in rehearsals. So it's very interesting to kind of have that dialogue with a composer who's alive, because we'd love to do that with Mozart, but you know, there's no email address. There's something otherworldly about coming in here, you know, phones off, no Netflix, no, you know, nothing like that. You know, we live in a world where you don't get to do that very often, first of all. But also, I think what's great about a concert like a symphonic concert is that, and I always say this to audiences, you can decide what this piece is about. You know, the imagination is there for you as an audience member. It's not like a movie or a TV show where you're following an interpretation of what's happening. Yeah, you can read about the Cadillac Ranch and you can read about a symphony and how that's been composed, but actually you're kind of free to imagine however you want. In the same way as you see a painting or something like that. There aren't that many places to do that in the world generally anymore. And so I think that it's sort of like a kind of timeless, very, very tranquil place to come and experience, you know, first of all, some incredibly talented people on stage playing instruments in a way that, you know, it's quite a strange thing that we do really in terms of concerts. We still use paper, we still turn pages and all these kinds of things. And so in a way, it's kind of like a pause of everything else that's going on. But ultimately, it's great entertainment.